Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with Chapter 5 of Ventures in Book Collecting by William Harris Arnold. And this is called Some 18th Century Books and Letters. Samuel Johnson, the great Cham of literature, as Smollett proclaimed him, was regarded by his contemporaries as the leading Englishman of letters of his time, and the verdict of today confirms this opinion. The monumental dictionary, which established the compiler's repute as a scholar of first rank, has of course long been relegated to the etymological limbo. It is not so easy to understand the present-day neglect of the greater portion of his prose and verse. Surely there is much to delight the receptive mind in: the lives of the poet, the rambler, and Rassalis. Those who love to travel in unfrequent regions may have the best of company in A Journey of the Western Islands, while the restless inquirer may reach philosophic calm in perusing the stately lines of The Vanity of Human Wishes. Yet, notwithstanding the disregard of his literary product as an outcome of the years, we have acquired a fuller appreciation of Johnson's noble character, his commanding genius, and the wisdom of his comments, his criticisms, and his dicta, as delineated with unexampled clarity by the most faithful of disciples, and further disclosed by the many other biographies, several of which antedate Boswell's greater work. Other testimonies are the abundant reminiscences of distinguished friends, and scores of Johnson's own letters, which from time to time have been rescued from obscurity. In recent years, we have had the illuminating contributions of Dr. A. Edward Newton. This ardent Johnsonian has brought a delighted public to a fresh consideration of the exceptional qualities of the great man. It is often said that but for the skillful pen of James Boswell, we should have placed Johnson on a much lower plane. But this is to lose sight of the fact that the philosopher's high fame was secure before the gifted young Scot even sought his acquaintance. It goes without saying that, but for Boswell, we should not have known anything like as much of Johnson. On the other hand, had there been no Boswell, we still should have known more about Johnson than we know of any individual who lived in his day and generation. And we have here a portrait of James Boswell, drawn in 1793 by George Dance. And the reference here to A. Edward Newton is quite timely, as the last book that I read aloud here was one by A. Edward Newton, and I own two of his books on my collection here. This is not said in the least degree as disparagement of the best biographers, but merely to assist in dissipating the erroneous notion that Johnson's renown is beyond his deserts, and arose from a cause other than the innate greatness of the man himself. As viewed by his contemporaries, Johnson was not only the leading man of letters, exercising a sway even greater than that of his predecessors Pope and Swift and Addison in their day. In him was also seen the most important and most interesting person of the time. Johnson's extraordinary mind and the wide scope of his learning afforded Boswell a rare opportunity for the exercise of his genius. With almost slavish devotion, the biographer performed his self-imposed task. The result is the unrivaled record we know so well, a record of which the merit, above all else, is the portrayal of the hero with unsparing hand, just as the author actually knew him. Every admirer of Dr. Johnson will own a copy of The Life. Whether the first edition will be preferred to one of the best modern editions depends on individual taste and susceptibility. Collectors and students require both. I felicitate myself in the possession of two copies of the first edition, each of which has its separate claim for attention. One has the distinction of being an uncut copy, in the original light blue paper boards, as issued in 1791, in two rather bulky quarto volumes. The other is a presentation copy to Sir Francis Lumb. When Johnson had acquired a wide recognition for his talents, the king expressed a desire to meet him. This resulted in a private conversation which Johnson delighted to recount with fullest detail. While Boswell was preparing his admirable account of this memorable interview, Sir Francis was pleased to take a great deal of trouble in submitting to the king a minute of the incident. It was doubtless for this kindness that Boswell thus inscribed the flyleaf of the volume, one of his presentation copies of The Life. To Sir Francis Lumb, Baronet, from his obliged humble servant, the author. A volume of letters of the younger Pliny is a tangible suggestion of Johnson's early repute as a Latin scholar. It is evident that he acquired the book before he was 17, for the inside of the front cover bears his name and date as shown here in facsimile. Sam Johnson, March 30th, 1726. And there is the facsimile there on the right-hand page. At the top of the title page is his signature again, and on the inside of the back cover he has written Sam Johnson, his book. At the instigation of several London booksellers associated for the purpose of bringing out a new edition of the English poets, Johnson then, in his 69th year, agreed to write brief biographical prefaces, but the plan as it proceeded was so expanded that immediately after the first issue in connection with the poetical writings, a separate large type edition was brought out in 4 sizable volumes under the title The Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets with Critical Observations on Their Works. There are 52 lives in all. The space devoted to each varies from a few pages for the lesser poets to half a volume for those masters of verse, Pope and Dryden. The lives unquestionably added much to Johnson's long-established fame. Some 12 or 15 years ago, in the catalogue of an unimportant book auction held in New York City, I was surprised to find a copy of the separate edition that may be considered the most desirable of all copies of this, the most interesting production of Johnson's pen. On the flyleaf of the first volume is written the name of the original owner, H.L. Thrale, Johnson's Mrs. Thrale. No one needs to be told the importance of the Thrales in Johnson's life, that at Streatham, their suburban home, Johnson spent many of his happiest days, and that there much of the lives of the poets was written certainly gives additional association interest to these well-worn old volumes. But this is not all. On the broad margins of page after page of each of the 4 volumes is the always legible handwriting of the vivacious owner, or hundreds of notes, sometimes mere exclamations, sometimes long comments, all of course relating to the printed text. These manuscript bits were written during a period of more than 15 years. Many have the year, date, and some are signed with initials. A few are here reproduced with the appropriate text. Johnson, he, in brackets Milton, took both the usual degrees, in brackets at Cambridge, that of bachelor in 1628 and that of master in 1632, but he left the university with no kindness for institution, alienated either by the injudicious severity of his governors or his own capricious perverseness. Mrs. Thrale, the first of these I fear it was. They have never whipped a lad since for fear of driving away a second Milton. There was no danger. Johnson, of him that knows much, it is natural to suppose that he has read with diligence. Yet I rather believe that the knowledge of Dryden was gleaned from accidental intelligence and various conversation, by a quick apprehension, a judicious selection, and a happy memory, a keen appetite for knowledge, and a powerful digestion, by vigilance that permitted nothing to pass without notice, and a habit of reflection that suffered nothing useful to be lost, a mind like Dryden's, always curious, always active, to which every understanding was proud to be associated, and to which everyone solicited the regard, by an ambitious display of himself, had a more pleasant, perhaps a nearer way to knowledge than by the silent progress of solitary reading. I do not suppose that he despised books, or intentionally neglected them, but that he was carried out by the impetuosity of his genius to more vivid and speedy instructors, and that his studies were rather desultory and fortuitous than constant and systematical. Mrs. Thrale, this is a portrait of Dr. Johnson's own mind and manners. I told him so, and he was not ill pleased. Johnson, of his, in brackets Dryden's, petty habits or slight amusements, tradition has retained little. Of the only 2 men whom I have found to whom he was personally known, one told me that at the house which he frequented, called Will's Coffee House, the appeal of any literary dispute was made to him, and the other related that his armchair, which in the winter had a settled and prescriptive place by the fire, was in the summer placed in the balcony, and that he called the 2 places his winter and his summer seat. This is all the intelligence which his 2 survivors afforded me. Mrs. Thrale, like old Goosey Evanson, who showed me 2 seats in his little garden, and said with much serious pomp, This I call my allegro, and this my penseroso. A great thing indeed. But he was imitating Dryden. Dryden seems to have lived more in the town than in the country. His poems are very rarely filled with rural imagery. Johnson. If the excellence of Dryden's work was lessened by his indignance, their number was increased, and I know not how it will be proved that if he had written less he would have written better, or that indeed he would have undergone the toil of an author, if he had not been solicited by something more pressing than the love of praise. But as it is said by his Sebastian, what has been is unknown, what is appears. Mrs. Thrale. For what men say I plainly hear, and what men do I see. But that which is in their hearts they hold, oh, that is hid from me. Johnson. Whoever wishes to attain an English style familiar, but not coarse and elegant, but not ostentatious, must give his days and night to the volumes of Addison. Mrs. Thrale. This very expression I heard Johnson use to Mr. Woodhouse, the poetical shoemaker. When they met at Mr. Thrale's house in Southwark, A.D. 1763 or 1764, I begged it might be inserted in the Lives, and he did insert it. Johnson. But he, in brackets, Congreve, treated the Muses with ingratitude, for having long conversed familiarly with the great, he wished to be considered rather as a man of fashion than of wit, and when he received a visit from Voltaire, disgusted him by the despicable foppery of desiring to be considered not as an author but a gentleman. To which the Frenchman replied, that if he had been only a gentleman, he should not come to visit him. Mrs. Thrale. It was not affectation, though he did treat the Muses with ingratitude. He lived with duchesses more willingly than with wits. He was, less idiomatical. It might have lost somewhat of its genuine Anglicism. What he attempted he performed. He is never feeble, and he did not wish to be energetic. He is never rapid, and he never stagnates. His sentences have neither studied amplitude nor effective brevity. His periods, though not diligently rounded, are voluble, and I'm not sure what that word is. I'm dealing with a passage of an older form of written English. Whoever wishes to attain an English style familiar, but not coarse, and elegant, but not ostentatious, must give his days and night to the volume of Addison. Facsimile of one of Mrs. Thrale's marginal comments in her copy of Johnson's Lives of the Poet. He was, I believe, a truly proud Salopian, thinking much more of birth than of talents. Johnson. In the poetical works of Dr. Swift, there is not much upon which the critic can exercise his powers. They are often humorous, almost always light, and have the qualities which recommend such compositions, easiness and gaiety. They are, for the most part, what their author intended. The diction is correct, the numbers are smooth, and the rhymes exact. There seldom occurs a hard-labored expression or a redundant epithet. All his verses exemplify his own definition of a good style. They consist of proper words in proper places. Mrs. Thrale. The verses on his own death are unequalled. His South Sea ballad comprises more wit and more aquatic allusions than one could think it possible for man to find, and his comical act of the dream concerning Sandy's Ovid is irresistibly humorous and fastidious. If he would not laugh himself, he would not suffer me to be serious. The 3 Johnson letters in my collection were written in his last years. One of these is to his schoolmate and lifelong friend, the Reverend Dr. Taylor. A pathetic epistle for Johnson's always precarious health was fast declining. The letter is here first published. Dear Sir, I went in October to Brighthelmston in a very feeble state, but I grew better, and though not well, have much less to complain of. I am now willing to resume the offices of life, and particularly to do what I can for my cousin Collier's. You sent me a will and recommended me to carry it to the council, which I am willing to do, But do not, till you have instructed me and knew what is expected from the will, not what questions I am to ask. You will therefore, dear sir, recollect the affair, and give me what instruction you can, for I am very much in the dark, not being used to business and not having much investigated the case now before me. Do not let your letter come, however, without some account of your health. As you might have suspected of me, I suspect of you. That silence is no good sign, and I am afraid that you are not well. Take care of yourself. We have outlived many friends. Let us keep close to one another. I am, dear sir, your most affectionate Sam Johnson. London, December 7th, 1782, to the Reverend Dr. Taylor in Ashburn, Derbyshire. 6 months later, in a letter to Mrs. Thrale, the sick but brave old man, with a frankness characteristic of the period, writes of the means adopted to correct his physical disorders. This letter, which had been printed before, seems to me interesting enough to warrant publication here. There is one short paragraph, however, which is not feasible to print. Dear Madame, I thought your letter long in coming. I suppose it is true that I looked but languid at the exhibition, but I have been worse since. Last Wednesday, the Wednesday of last week, I came home ill from Mr. Jodrell's, and after a tedious, oppressive, impatient night, sent an excuse to General Paoli, and took on Thursday 2 brisk cathartics and a dose of calomel. Little things do me no good. At night I was much better. Next day cathartic again, and the third day opium for my cough. I lived without flesh all the 3 days. The recovery was more than I expected. I went to church on Sunday quite at ease. The exhibition prospers so much that Sir Joshua says it will maintain the Academy. He estimates the probable amount at £3,000. Stevens is of opinion that Croft's books will sell for near 3 times as much as they cost, which, however, is not more than might be expected. Favour me with a direction to Musgrave of Ireland. I have a charitable office to propose to him. Is he knight or baronet? My present circle of employment is as narrow for me as the circus for Mrs. Montagu. When I first settled in this neighbourhood, I had Richardson and Lawrence and Mrs. Allen at hand. I had Mrs. Williams, then no bad companion, and Levitt for a long time always to be had. If I now go out, I must go far for company, and at last come back to 2 sick and discontented women who can hardly talk, if they had anything to say, and whose hatred of each other makes one great exercise of their faculties. But with all these evils, positive and privative, my health in its present humour promises to mend, and I in my present humour promise to take care of it, and if we both keep our words, we may yet have a brush at the cobwebs in the sky. Let my dear loves write to me, and do you write often yourself. Dear Madame, your most obliged and most humble servant, Sam Johnson, May 8th, 1783, London. To Mrs. Thrale at Bath. The short paragraph I spoke of has been crossed by pen strokes and then carefully covered by a strip of paper. Not a word can be made out. What are we to think of this little mystery? The dear loves of the last paragraph are, of course, Mrs. Thrale's 3 daughters. The third letter I have written to Francis Barber, a Negro who, in his relation to Johnson, was much more than servant and little less than friend. September 16th, 1783. Dear Francis, I rather wonder that you have never written, but that is not necessary, for I purpose to be with you on Thursday before dinner. As Thursday is my birthday, I would have a little dinner got, and would have you invite Mrs. Desmoulins, Mrs. Davis, that was about Mrs. Williams, and Mr. Allen, and Mrs. Gardiner. I am yours, and etc., Sam Johnson. While Johnson was planning his will, he inquired of his physician what would be a suitable annuity for a faithful servant, being told that in the case of a nobleman £50 will be considered adequate. Then, said Johnson, shall I be a nobilissimus, for I mean to leave Frank £70 a year, and I desire you to tell him so. Actually, he did more, for in addition to the annuity, he made Barber residuary legatee, by which he received £1,500. Johnson, with his broad outlook, included among his many friends the founder of Methodism. A little bit of comment repeated by Boswell gives us a personal glimpse of Wesley in the very words of Johnson. John Wesley's conversation is good, but he is never at leisure. He is always obliged to go at a certain hour. This is very disagreeable to a man who loves to fold his legs and have out his talk, as I do. No wonder that a man who usually began the day by preaching at 5 o'clock in the morning and delivered no less than 800 sermons in a single year found it necessary to set exact limits to his social visits. I happen to have a brief but typical letter from Wesley to one of his religious helpers. Near Manchester, April 3rd, 1782. Dear Tommy, be of good courage. You have had a token for good at Lynn, where it was supposed the case was desperate, and I do not doubt but you will see good days in and about Fakenham, though the people as yet do not know much of discipline, and no wonder if they have never yet had ye rules of our societies. First explain them at large, and afterwards enforce them, very mildly and very steadily. Molly Franklin and Sister Proudfoot are good women. Deal very gently with them, and lovingly labor to convince those whom it concerns of the evil of buying or selling on the Lord's day. I am, dear Tommy, your affectionate friend and brother, J. Wesley. There is a little book in my collection, which has on the flyleaf an inscription in Boswell's hand, expressive of Johnson's deeply religious nature and his concern for the most intimate young friend. And we have a reproduction of a pamphlet or something of the sort. It's not labeled, but here it is. A pamphlet or a title page to some of the writings of Francis Gastrell, D.D. Canon of Christ Church and preacher to the Honorable Society of Lincoln's Inn. The serious purpose of the volume is well indicated by the title page, here reproduced in facsimile. So that's what that was, the title page in facsimile. This is the inscription, James Boswell, London, 1790. So there is the inscription. This book was recommended by Dr. Samuel Johnson. See my journal of our tour to the Hebrides, edit page 3. Johnson's frequently expressed opinions of Scotland and its people almost always implied a feeling of contempt, but were so often accompanied by touches of humour as to leave open to question whether such remarks were not more playful than severe. I am acquainted with many natives of the land of cakes, and no one of them has other than an amused tolerance for these amiable visions. Boswell, a Scot, perpetuated the fame of Johnson for all time. Another Scot, Robert Borthwick Adam of Buffalo, brought together in this the country of his adoption, a collection of Johnsonian books and proof sheets of letters and manuscripts, far exceeding any other in extent and importance. In later years, his namesake, with sentimental zeal, has added one interesting rarity after another, and now the third of the name, at the age of 4, made a member of the Johnson Society of Lichfield, gives promises of continuing the honorable succession. No student of Johnson could be content until he has made his pilgrimage to the big city on the shore of Lake Erie. Joshua Reynolds, shortly after his first visit to Italy, casually picked up a copy of Johnson's Life of Richard Savage, and, as Boswell relates, began to read it while standing with his arm leaning against a chimney-piece. It seized his attention so strongly that, not being able to lay down the book till he had finished it, when he attempted to move, he found his arm totally benumbed. It was not long after this occurrence that Johnson and Reynolds first met in London at the house of certain common friends. Reynolds was delighted with his new acquaintance, and Johnson was outspoken in his appreciation of the young artist. The friendship thus began continued without interruption to the last day of Johnson's life. It was a recognition of this affectionate relation that Boswell dedicated to Reynolds the immortal biography, the frontispiece to which is an engraving of the well-known portrait of Johnson, painted by Reynolds 4 years after their acquaintance began. And here is this frontispiece portrait. Reynolds was chosen in 1768 as the first president of the Royal Academy. In my collection is a presentation copy of his opening address. In view of art vagaries of our time, may it not be salutary here to recall 2 brief paragraphs of that discourse of a century and a half ago. I would chiefly recommend that an implicit obedience to the rules of art, as established by the great masters, should be exacted from the young students. that those models which have passed through the approbation of ages should be considered by them as perfect and as infallible guides, as subjects for their imitation, not their criticism. How much liberty may be taken to break through those rules, and as the poet expresses it, to snatch a grace beyond the reach of art, may be an after consideration, when the pupils become masters themselves. It is then, when their genius has received its utmost improvement, that rules may be dispensed with. But let us not destroy the scaffold until we have raised the building. Reynolds was president of the Academy for 22 years. Of his annual discourses delivered to the students, I have the original issues of no less than 10, all presentation copies. 2 of these are merely inscribed, from the author. Each of the other 8 names the honored recipient. These well-printed big-type quartos are quite gay in their marbled paper covers. I am fortunate, too, in the possession of a copy of Arabian Nights Entertainments, with J. Reynolds modestly written at the top of the title page of each of the 4 volumes. Sir Joshua's original ownership is further authenticated by a note on the flyleaf of Volume 1, which reads, Frederick T. Colby, 1890, from the library of my uncle, C.E. Palmer, great-nephew of Sir Joshua Reynolds. On the inside of the front cover of each volume is the bookplate of Mrs. Colby. Among my autographs, I have a note in the artist's hand which reads, Mr. Reynolds presents his compliments to Mr. Percy, and will do himself the honour of waiting on him today at 2 o'clock. Dr. Goldsmith will likewise attend him. Leicestershire Fields, April 2nd, 1768. Here we have 3 of the original members of the celebrated literary club getting together for an afternoon off. It would surely be interesting could we learn what was their happy purpose on that early April day. A later note by Reynolds, now a knight, is written on the first page of a folded sheet. This time we have the intention definitely stated. Sir Joshua Reynolds presents his compliments to Mr. West. He has received an invitation from Mr. Hankey to come and see his drawings on Wednesday next. This morning he has received the enclosed letter from Mr. Hankey. If Mr. West accepts of the invitation, Sir Joshua will send his coach to Mr. West's house at half an hour after 1 o'clock and accompany him thither. We turn the leaf. Behold, there on the wide double page is a powerful sketch by Benjamin West, a big man as burly as Dr. Johnson himself, holding a horse by the bit, is looking away from the animal at some object of terror not made visible to us. Just how West happened to make this casual use of Sir Joshua's note, we may leave to idle conjecture. The real matter is that we have on this sizable old sheet a worthy souvenir of 2 eminent artists of the 18th century. The sketch, reduced to 1 quarto the size of the original, is shown on page 141. It is perhaps a little curious that I have another note written to the West on a large sheet with the blank spaces this time utilized for several small sketches, which, however, are too incomplete to interest us. The note, dated 1796, will have no importance in itself, but was written by Lady Isabella Strange, the heroine of a romantic incident of the troublous days of '45. I confess that I chose to add the missive to my collection not so much because of Benjamin West's sketches, as for the gallant anecdote of the girlhood days of the quick-witted lady. Robert Strange, the distinguished Scotch engraver, at the age of 24, joined the Jacobite army under Charles Edward Stuart. One of the artist's services to the young pretender was to engrave his portrait. He also etched plates for a banknote designed for payment of the troops. After the defeat of the Highlanders at Culloden, Strange found shelter not far from the field of battle, at the home of his fiancée, Miss Lumsden. He was sought there by some of the victors. As the soldiers were seen approaching, the intrepid girl lifted her hoop-skirt, and the fugitive took refuge under it. While the futile search went on, the fair one calmly caroled Jacobite songs over her needlework. In the year following, the lovers were married. And here we have a sketch by Benjamin West. As is well known, Strange had a very successful career. The high merit of his engraving of one of West's paintings brought him the honour of knighthood. Another little bit of writing of 150 years ago may help us in some degree to picture once more the congenial relationship of certain members of the literary club. It is addressed to the Reverend Dr. Percy, well remembered as the scholarly compiler of the relics of ancient English poetry. Dear Sir, Goldsmith insists that our meeting shall be tomorrow evening at his chambers. Pray come, yours sincerely, James Boswell. Tuesday, 6 May. Letters of Oliver Goldsmith are among the scarcest desidera of the autograph collector. Dr. James Granger, one of Dr. Percy's frequent correspondents, was the first to introduce him to Goldsmith. Granger wrote to Percy in 1764, "When I taxed little Goldsmith for not writing as he promised me, his answer was that he never wrote a letter in his life, and faith I believe him, except to a bookseller for money." After 15 years of watchful waiting, I was one day called on the telephone by the old-time dealer in autographs, Patrick Magdigan, who told me he had just secured a most interesting Goldsmith letter that had been treasured as an heirloom by a Nova Scotia family for over 100 years. He was offering it to me first. Mr. Magdigan called it a great bargain, and so it was, for I shall ever maintain a close-mouthed reticence as to the price, for I have no wish to establish with my friends an undeserved reputation for lavish expenditure. This letter was written to a son and namesake of Goldsmith's most beloved brother. To him the traveller was addressed and dedicated. The reader, I am sure, will welcome repetition here of the oft-quoted opening lines. "Where'er I roam, whatever realms to see, my heart untravelled fondly returns to thee. Still to my brother turns with ceaseless pain, and drags at each remove a lengthening chain." Here is the letter. London, June 7th, 1768. My dear Henry, your dear father's death has afflicted me deeply. The news of this dreadful event only reached me yesterday, and although I have already sent my love and condolences in a letter, which you will see, I pen this farther line to my dear nephew to express the hope that you and your brother, young as you both are, will bear yourselves as the son of such a man should. As to your own future, I shall not rest until I hit upon some means of serving you, and it may be that through the influence of some of my friends here, you may procure a situation suited to your talents. Meanwhile, attend diligently to your studies, neglect nothing that can advance your interest when an opening occurs. Are you still inclined towards a military career? That would necessitate, besides a certain temper and constitution, a considerable sum of ready money. Something, however, might be managed abroad in the West Indies or in America. Let me hear from you, my dear Henry, and with much love to you both, believe me, your affectionate uncle, Oliver Goldsmith. The young Henry thus addressed was a lad of 15. He eventually entered the military service and became an assistant commissary general, stationed at Cape Breton and afterward at St. John, New Brunswick. 2 of his 3 sons settled in Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. The letter, carefully preserved by the family for over a century and a half, has now fallen into no less appreciative hands. Johnson's eulogy of his lovable friend Goldsmith should be widely known. No critic's discernment is needed to recognize it as a masterpiece of succinct characterization. Goldsmith, a man of such variety of powers and such felicity of performance that he always seemed to do best that which he was doing, a man who had the art of being minute without tediousness and general without confusion, whose language was copious without exuberance, exact without constraint, and easy without weakness. Of course, the Richardson, whose loss as a neighbour was lamented by Dr. Johnson in his letters to Mrs. Thrale, was the master printer Samuel Richardson, who, as the author of Pamela, took the town by surprise. Before this most successful novel appeared, there had been any number of heroic romances of plot and many fictional character studies. But Richardson, at the age of 50, in this, his first book, devised a love story of English domestic life, which possessed both plot interest and character interest. This had never been done before. The circumstances are well known. Having shown considerable ability in writing prefaces and dedications for books brought to him to be printed, Richardson was asked by 2 London booksellers to write for them a little volume of letters in a common style, on which subjects as might be used to those country readers who were unable to indite for themselves. This he undertook, and, as the author himself tells us, in the progress of it, writing 2 or 3 letters to instruct handsome girls who were obliged to go out to service, as we phrase it, how to avoid the snares that might be laid against their virtue, he recalled a story of real life which had been told him years before about just such a girl, whereupon he put his task aside to write a novel based on the circumstances of the story. This was Pamela in 4 volumes, 2 of which were published in 1741 and 2 in 1742. Notwithstanding the great success of Pamela, Richardson did not bring out a second novel for several years. Clarissa Harlowe was published by installments in 7 volumes, and another of larger print in 7 volumes in 1747 to 48. The third novel, Sir Charles Grandison, was published in 2 editions, one in 7 volumes and another of larger print in 6 volumes, issued simultaneously in 1753 to 54. And here we have a reproduction of the title page of Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. Both Clarissa and Grandison, as well as Pamela, are written in epistolary form. Richardson's personal letters are much in the style of his fictional characters. I doubt that any truer example of this resemblance exists than a very long letter entirely devoted to Clarissa that is now in my collection. It was written in reply to one of the numerous communications the author received from admiring women. And we have here a title page of Clarissa and a title page of the history of Charles Grandison reproduced here. As Clarissa is unquestionably Richardson's best work, it seems to me that the letter, notwithstanding its length, should be given in full. So far as I know, it is here printed for the first time. December 20th, 1748. Dear Madame, when you are pleased to decline singling out in Clarissa any particular virtue or excellence, you disappoint me a little, though you give so polite a reason for it, because I should have seen by your distinguishing someone, which, among the many that adorn your mind, was what you yourself thought most preferable. Express yourself at your own expense. What words are these? Do you think that there is not a justice due oneself as well as to the rest of the world? And can you, who are so quick-sighted to the merits of others, be allowed to be blind to your own? How judiciously do you observe that there is not 1 in 10 of our sex that have sense enough to captivate any woman of common understanding? Let me tell you that did not a docility of mind in the fair sex, and great condescension and great charity and great good nature assist, there would not be 1 in 20 in an age of flashes and foibles that would make an impression. Oh, that your sex would not, so often as they do, permit their hearts to be under the dominion of their eyes and ears. How many more happy marriages would there be than there are if the fair sex, indeed if both sexes, would choose for intellectual rather than personal qualities? Were you, you say, Madame, addressed by a Hickman and a Lovelace, you would choose the former in preference to the latter, if it were only to show me how strong an impression my advice against such as the latter has made upon you. This is extremely obliging, but let me tell you, my dear Miss Granger, that while you can express such an indifference as you express to a character like that of Mr. Hickman, you will be in some danger should a Lovelace make his addresses to you at the same time. To say nothing of your generous though hazardous hope of reforming a Lovelace by your example, you must consider that you would be apt to think better of him than he would deserve unless you had an opportunity, which the reader of the history of Clarissa have, though she had not, of judging of his heart and his head by his private communications of the tendency of both to a Belford, that is to say, to a trusty friend of his own caste. General characters ought to have great weight in a lady's choice. A light, frothy, libertine air and conversation, a disavowal of good principles, a liberty taken of ridiculing religion and serious things, and of worthy men and worthy women, will be all you'll have to judge by. And indeed this would and ought to be enough to a discreet lady, for men gather not grapes or thorns or figs of thistles. But the fashion of the present age will a good deal lessen the terror that such symptoms ought to inspire, if they are attended with an effronter that shows the man cannot doubt. If Mr. Hickman's respectful love, if his worthy character, if his beneficent disposition, if his perseverance will not give him a preference for the sake of those good qualities, what shall I say? Don't you consider, Madame, that he appears in no hands an insignificant or weak character? but in those of Lovelace, who would have made even Miss Howe look silly, and of Miss Howe, who would have made any man but Lovelace look like a fool. Hickman, madame, is a generous-minded man. He could not, if used tolerably by a wife, make her sensible of what an undue control was. Lovelace was a triumpher for triumph's sake. Read Colonel Morden's letter again, if you please, at the latter end of Volume 3, and that passage in Lovelace's Volume 4, page 192-93, where he tells you how submissive his wife must be, how she must sigh over him when present, if he be in the humor to receive her sighs, look after him as far as she can see him on his going from her, and go out of her wits for joy on his return. You say you would not wish to have the government entirely in your own hands. This is generously said, and yet do not think, madame, you should not like to be complimented with power. Miss Howe is a very saucy girl. She spares not her mother. This cannot be the case of the lady I have the honour to write to. Perhaps Miss Howe was not so saucy to her first love, Sir George Coleman. But was she not ungenerous, think you, to play upon a worthy man, whom she intended to have, because she saw from his great love for her that she might? And are you sure that those ladies who form their judgment of the worthy man's intellects by what his love made him bear with the vixen would not have treated him in the like circumstances nearly alike? Ah, my dear Miss Granger, take care that those saucy intelligences of the soul, called eyes, as you prettily express yourself, are not the only indicatives. But I will not say more. It was easy for me to have drawn in Mr. Hickman all the graces that even a Miss Howe might have charmed with. But I was willing to give more room for a saucy girl to exercise her sprightly talents, for the sake of the correction I had a mind to give by her from her amiable friend to all such saucy girls, and at the same time to show the sex that one man could not be everything, and that the man to be happy with was rather a Hickman than a Lovelace, and for this reason I have made Miss Howe happy with him, though she deserved to be a little punished. Do you think she did not? Have you read the whole quite through, madame? If you have not, you'll find by the conclusion of the work that there was no room to imagine that Mr. Hickman assumed any command. Thank you, dear madame, for the objections you hint at, but it was so delicate a point to make a Clarissa guiltless in going away with a man, or rather in giving him an opportunity to trick her away, or in corresponding with him clandestinely, that I thought I could not be too particular in recounting the provocations she had from her family. Mr. Lovelace, in his first visit to Smith's, I know, must displease you, but when the uncontrollable wretch found himself disappointed, he says, you know, that he must have been merry or mad, and that Clarissa would have despised him, had she heard that he had been sighing for her in the back shop. But the whole of that scene is to display the impenetrableness and the obduracy and the levity of such rakes, and what unconcerned airs they could give themselves, while the poor innocents were hiding themselves in corners, their hearts bursting with grief, and perhaps with undeserved disgrace. I have written a long letter, but had I not been very much engaged, you would have had a chance for a much longer. Yet I should have been loath to have repeated anything written in the work. Once more, I thank you for the favour of yours, and beg you to forgive the hurry which occasions me to be less perfect and less particular than otherwise would have been, dear madame. Your faithful and obedient servant, Richardson. Though frequently urged to write more novels, the author added none to the highly successful trio. He did, however, complete the letter writer, but did not put his name to it. The volume bore this title: Letters written to and for particular friends on the most important occasions, directing not only the requisite style and forms to be observed in writing familiar letters, but how to think and act justly and prudently in the common concerns of human life. While the 173 letters which comprise the book are intended as models for a wide variety of experience, love affairs have precedence. The little manual had a successful sale for more than 20 years, and is reputed to have found particular favour with amorous country wenches. Another long unpublished letter of Richardson is in my collection, but I hear my readers say, enough is as good as a feast. As I turn to the next 18th century writer, I find myself anticipating the smiles with which he will be greeted. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. Sean will be back on Sunday with chapter 6, which is titled Some 18th Century Books and Letters, Part 2.